Parousia of Wind, Lunar Cry, Chapter 1, The Uninvited Guest.
You've got your hands full tonight, Aaron.
Aaron was pouring a glass of wine for another man when Delampere called to him with his rough sea pipes. The air at the glass well was thick with smoke. Every hookah in the lounge was full, and the bar had but one empty seat to take the captain. "Don't we all, Captain?" the barkeep answered, gesturing to the open chair. "I'm sure it's hard moving cargo with all these extra tourists around." He offered the wine to the captain, and he obliged with a nod.
"It's hard just keeping our spot in port,"
Delampere began as Aaron poured.
"Would you believe this? The dockies tried to get rid of us to make room for one of the liners."
The captain was livid. He had sailed into Sinus 3 nights ago, at the start of the Disverian Lunar Festival. His goods from Diergdirk would have sold well regardless, but the festive climb had brought an even larger profit for the captain. At the end of each night, Delampere and his crew had come with full pockets to Aaron, and celebrated their success over his finest cactus wine in Ashish. Aaron was the only Yui barkeep port side, and so his was the lounge for every Yui salt that drifted into Sinus. It was an awkward sort of tavern, built against a rock shelf between the docks and one of the souks, inconvenient to reach from both areas. But while it lacked in elegance, Aaron had furnished it expertly. Cream-veiled curtains and odd-shaped glass ornaments decorated the lounge, while small bundles of fresh rose petals scented the bar and tables. Aaron nodded, familiar with the captain's antics. "I heard tales of a Yui causing trouble at the dock. I figured that was you." The captain scoffed.
"Is that how it's being told? Well, I shouldn't have to make a nuisance of myself to have my port clearance respected. The profit here is barely worth the indignity."
"Well, at least you have warmer waters waiting for you." In Sinus, Yui salts were common enough, but Aaron had never seen a Yui captain before Delampere. He had heard rumors of Yui-led vessels docking in the day and shipping off before the night, but Delampere ran his trade in the open moonlight. Delampere leaned forward over his burly forearms.
"Aye, but we're not done here yet. There's still Paragal, after all."
Port Paragal was to the south of Sinus, along the Bay of Souls. Aaron had advised him it'd be best for him not to linger in Disverian waters, but the captain insisted he had his course and would be sticking to it. "Most don't like a Yui that stirs things up," Aaron said pointedly. Everyone tied to the continent of Yuin had blotched skin. Aaron's was discolored with clusters of dark brown that beaded him from his neck to his arms. His collar and bar jacket partially obscured his markings, but the captain made no effort to hide his unsightly patches. Delampere's face was like scrunched vellum, and ebony spots bled like ink blots down his old swarthy skin. Like most Yuis, he had dark black hair that frizzed into small curls that spilled out from under his white sea cap. The captain's sideburns and beard were grayed at their fringe, but he had glossy, dim eyes that spoke to more years. The captain had been very open with Aaron about his distaste for the practice of Yuis hiding their frontiers marks, such as they were called in the motherland. Aaron had explained that many did so out of necessity, but the captain still remained unsympathetic to this act. The more time Aaron had spent in the company of Delampere and his crew, the more he envied them. He had only brought the glasswell to what it was by carefully complying with what Disverians expected of a Yui man, but the crew of the life chair defied such expectations. They expressed a type of freedom in their manner and camaraderie that one would never see from a Disverian Yui. As a bartender, Aaron prided himself on being a good listener, and he had a talent for serving people just the right amount of sympathy. But he was out of his element when his customers were the ones giving him sympathy. No matter how he tried, Aaron found it hard to act neutral to the clear difference between them. Perhaps the captain recognized this, for he answered Aaron softly.
"I don't come to bring you trouble now. You've been good to me and my crew. I want you to continue to prosper as you do tonight."
Nobles, politicians, and celebrities the world over had come to Disveria to celebrate the double full moon with His Highness and the nation. Though the Lunar Festival had seen out its final night, they stayed for the waning gala, as was tradition. This year it was being held by their princess at the royal villa. The influentials had brought with them entourages of servants and salts. While it was improper for them to accompany their masters to the gala, they were more than welcome in the markets and taverns of Sinus. It was this foreign audience that filled Aaron's lounge tonight, rather than his typical bunch of rowdy Yui dockhands.
"I'll miss this wine."
The captain held out his empty glass and sighed.
Nothing in the Ashen Country quite as smooth.
Aaron smirked. Did you already finish the casket you bought from me, then?
No, but that'll probably last us a few days on the open sea. Hardly enough for the return trip. We might have to stop by at the solstice for a resupply.
He raised an eyebrow suggestively. Aaron was against that. I'm sure the Oriole will more than satisfy in that regard. Though I can't say to have tasted it, for the wine there is so light you can drink it like water.
All the more reason for me to come back. I'll bring some so you can taste for yourself whether the rumor's true. I'll try to bring it in time for the next Lunar Festival.
The captain laughed, then handed Harren a sum of kales that was nearly 10 times the value of the wine he had drank. Harren blinked at the money, and the captain laughed again.
A friend of mine might pass through your bar later tonight to see me at the docks. I told him he could avoid all the bustle in the streets by going down this way. I know it's not fair for me to send someone here knowing they're not going to buy anything, so consider the extra here as my apology for that.
Harren was surprised, but not ungrateful for the man's generosity. Very well. Should I be watching for them?
Oh no, you don't have to worry about that,
he said, his smile scrunching his face in a position so familiar the lines from it were engraved in the parchment of his skin.
In fact, he added on, my friend would appreciate if you don't search him out at all. He's a bit of a recluse.
Aaron shrugged. I'll act as if you said nothing, then. Will this be the last I see of you, Captain? Delampierre nodded.
Until next I port, yes.
I wish you safe sailing, then, Captain. May the goddess bless your journey.
Fate's not my god, but I'll take the blessing all the same. Until the tides bring us together again.
Captain Delampierre rose from his stool and strode away. Harren looked at the money in his palm and stared after the captain's back until the old salt vanished down the dock-bound stairs. He hoped that this friend of Delampierre's was as harmless as the captain made him out to be, but a sour feeling stirred in his gut. He'd known the captain might be trouble as soon as he'd heard rumors going around that the crew of the Life Chair had once crossed paths with the masked devil. As if to affirm his intuition, when he pocketed the captain's coins, they seemed to rattle like the chains of the old god. A bad omen. Darris watched the ocean's foaming waters slip from the coastline. He had spent all night picking up the bottles and trash of the waning gala's guests, and his back ached all the worse for it. 5 lashes they had given him. He had brought everything well in time for the gala, but still, 5 lashes. He'd always told people he worked for royalty, but what did that mean but from whom he received his beatings from? With the princess and her guests inside dining, Darris had the shoreline to himself. He'd sat down with his trash cart against one of the palms. The tide had lowered, so that the edge of a sandstone cliff peeked out of the ocean's ebb. Os and Duo, the twin silver moons, stood over the sea's pale body. Os, ever distant, shined gently from its high place in the heavens, while Duo, the larger of the two, was near overwhelming in its brightness, in spite of its wane. It would be nearly 10 months until the two celestials would be full at the same time again, and that would still be too soon for Darris's liking. The number of beatings a servant took spiked so sharply around each lunar festival that it started to feel like part of the ceremony. A mocking voice interrupted his lounging. You finished with your work, Huey? Darris went stiff, giving him a jolt of pain from the sudden tensing. He clenched his teeth and gritted, standing up. Yes, sir. I just finished combing the beach, he answered, trying his best to seem like he had only just set the cart down. It was a royal guardsman. This one wasn't wearing his turban, but he was dressed in an ornate robe as befit his station. He reeked of wine, and his hand was perched uncomfortably close to the hilt of his scimitar. The man looked over Darris's full cart of trash and gave a small, approving nod, making Darris think, for a moment, that the guard would turn away and leave him to his labor. A naive thought. The guard pulled a flask from his satchel and made as if to offer it to Darris. It was something he might have fallen for a few years back, but he had grown familiar with this style of ploy. Doubtless, the guard would report that he'd caught the servant drinking on the job. Someone would smell his breath, and he'd be helpless to argue otherwise. The punishment for that would be far more severe than a simple 5 lashes. The guard gave him an expectant look, as if he were puzzled by Darris's hesitance, then shrugged and downed the bottle himself. He burped at the servant, filling the air with a raw blend of fish and fruity cactus wine that made Darris scrunch his nose. Say, boy, the guard asked, wiping his lower lip with a hairy arm. Yes, sir? Darius asked in return.
I think you missed a bottle.
It came too quick to react. The guard struck Darius across his left eye with the bottle. Darius spun down to the sand, and the guard snorted.
You should thank me, boy. Now you've got a nice black eye that goes with the rest of your spots.
The laugh bounced between Darius's ears as his back throbbed. The competing pains of his back and eye were too much to bear. All he could do was hunch and cower, withdrawing to the cart. The guard had another bout of drunken laughter that never seemed to end.
What's that noise now?
He asked, recovering from his amusement. It took Darius a moment to pick out what he'd meant. Above the lull of the waves was a low drone, like a thick drum pattering in a steady beat. Colors seemed to pop into the air, shades of violet and gray, as the sound rose in intensity.
It must be that blow to my head, Darius thought,
but the guard rubbed at his eyes as if he were seeing things as well. There was a rustle of leaves as two cowled figures emerged from the shore's dark brush. The two were garbed in all black, from their cloak to their gloves and leathers. The one in front had a face covered by a bony mask of silver marrow. It was shaped in the form of a scarab. The second figure stood directly behind the first. It was covered in a loose gray fabric that swayed in the ocean breeze like the shawl of a dancer. The figure was tall and thin. A pointed set of ears pressed upward like a cat's, straining against the fabric of its hood. Oddly, it didn't seem to have a face. The only thing under that hood was a dark, concave hollow. Its arms were of bone and pearl. Each seemed to split unnaturally from a shoulder socket before meeting together, forming into some kind of clawed limb. Even more disturbing was the large velvet organ attached to the creature's back, bigger than the creature itself. Two winged flaps spread from the center of the organ's folds and surrounded its waist. The structure pulsed, contracting and expanding rhythmically like some dark, aberrant heart, and instantly Darius knew that was where the noise was being produced. The masked figure's voice was calm and smooth. Funny, is it, to hurt a child you've trained to be passive? Come, coward. I'll make sure those hands of yours never lay on anyone again. Darius knew who the man was and could scarcely believe it. Plain as the full moon, the masked devil, Khonsu, stood before them, with his shadow pitched behind him. The guard cried out the devil's name so loud the boy thought the whole world would hear, and the sound coming from the shade's organ raised accordingly, growing in pitch so violently that Darius thought his ears would burst. But then the sound stopped. Suddenly, terribly, a deep terror took hold of him. He recalled this feeling. It was that same horrible sense of anticipation that he had felt between each of his lashings, not knowing when his tormentor would decide to stop. He crawled under the cart and hid, sweating and shuddering. The royal guardsman was pale as a ghost. His blade arm shook, unsteady.
You think I'm scared of you, devil? I'll kill you. Yeah, that's right. You and your monster!
The second figure swept forward in a whirl of fabric. Its arms split open at the elbow like the bones of a ribcage, unfurling a long, arced blade. The guard parried its slice with his own scimitar, but in his drunkenness he overextended. With its other arm, the creature extended another blade and sliced upward, severing the guard's hands in one clean motion. The guard gasped as his hands dropped to the sand, his right hand still clutching onto his blade as it fell. Khonsu was upon him in an instant, covering his mouth with his gloved hand before he could shriek. The guard flailed the stumps of his arms, pushing and kicking as he tried to wrench free. One of the bony shadow's blades started glowing, as if moonlight were being sucked into it. It gleamed brighter and brighter until, just as the guard was loosed from Khonsu's clutches, the weapon cut into him. There was a loud crack, a shattering noise like the breaking of glass, and then the guard dropped to the sand, motionless. Khonsu was coming towards the cart. Darius buried himself even further into the sand beneath it. He hid in his own arms, hoping that whenever he did find the courage to open his eyes again, both the guard and Khonsu would be gone, like a bad dream. "The man's still alive," Khonsu said, the cold edge of his voice cutting over the sound of the ocean's waves. How had he come so close? Darius wondered. He hadn't even heard the sound of his footsteps. "He'll bleed to death before long." Darius didn't move from his hiding place beneath the cart. Khonsu continued, "Find a way to arm yourself, and the next time someone puts a hand on you, you take it, I'm just a boy, sir, he protested. I couldn't. Khonsu was firm. Even a boy has the right to defend himself. You wouldn't let a viper bite you freely, and the fangs of a Disverian man are far crueler than any serpent's. Darius trembled. No matter how cruel that man had been, Darius couldn't stop thinking about him. The guard without his hands, his blood leaching into the greedy sand below. I'll leave it to you, Khonsu said. Suddenly a glass salve rolled under the cart. It was filled with a red, foamy jelly. You can stop his bleeding with this, but consider what I've said. Khonsu stepped away and walked past the cart in the direction of the villa. Wait, Darius called, poking his head out from his shelter. Why? Why are you here? Khonsu hummed. Someone expects me at the gala. I wouldn't be a devil if I didn't keep my appointments. You sure took your time. Hit it off with one of the nobles. Tumani cackled into her sash as Harshavati sulked out of the gallery. Traditionally, the Disverian royal guard wore turbans that wrapped over the shoulder into a long white band. Their robes were gray and dyed in the ancestral fashion, purple garnishing the ends of each baggy sleeve, gold embroidering the neck and chest, and perfectly balanced silhouettes of orange lizards and vines that patterned the body of the robe. Each guard held a scimitar and had a large circular shield over their left forearm, engraved with the forward-facing head of the Virya. Harshavati raised the lizard face of the shield to block Tumani from his sight. He had spent hours watching nobles make imbeciles of themselves and had no patience left for the woman's teasing. Someone's in a bad mood, she frowned. Good, he thought. Let her be disappointed. The dinner was a long one, he muttered. If Tumani wanted him to elaborate, he would have indulged her and probably gone into a tirade. However, she couldn't care less for his experience at the gala. How did Her Highness do? She asked, her black eyes ripe with interest. Tumani had large cheeks and bright teeth that made her enthusiasm infectious. Even Harshavati found himself softening a bit. She did well, he admitted. Even the pasty parasites from Constance were impressed by our princess's hosting ability. Harshavati had been in the royal guard since Besatis was a doddering child, but she had grown, faster than he'd realized, into a woman he would be proud to call their teacher, though Her Highness had a giant to live up to. Her father's reign had brought Disveria from a period of tyranny into its most prosperous years. Teacher Jakari had proved himself a far better man than his grandfather, while still maintaining the autonomy the prior teacher had worked so hard to maintain against the belligerence of the Kalentran Empire. Though Disveria was, by treaty, a vassal nation, the barrier the sands and mountains of the Tektite imposed had long afforded them of freedom from the dependencies the empire usually fostered upon its vassal states. Kalentra still received her annual dues, though. Truly, they did little enough to deserve it, but it was a necessary bribe to sustain access to the empire's valuable markets and medicines, and for the empire to stay well away from Disverian affairs. But this long-standing relationship was being imperiled by a single man. The terrorist, known as Khonsu, had put the imperial eye over Disveria lately. Even if the princess was not directly in line to inherit the throne, her uncle, the Tolnasher, would doubtless have difficulties continuing the legacy of Jakari and his grandfather. Ooh, a man of Constance would make a striking match for our princess, Tumani said, oblivious to the precarious state of their nation. She always had her head in all the wrong places. Though Harshavati did agree with some of her concerns about the princess. Her Highness was already 28, and still she had not settled on a suitor for herself. Her father had been little over half that age when he'd taken his queen. His Highness perhaps doted on his daughter too much. She would need to decide on someone before the year's end. That had been her father's ultimatum. But how many times now had the princess coerced her father into giving her decision more time? Whether she was going to be Tisha or not, a child by her would, some day, be up for the throne. The princess had argued with Harshavati that her younger half-brother or one of her cousins would continue her father's line adequately without her. Did she not see that her father wished her married for reasons beyond the royal succession? She was his only child by his first wife. No one could ever replace her in his mind. Harshavati only wished he could make Besatis understand that. Would our Highness think the same? Harshavati said, reflecting. Constance would make a strong ally in preserving Desvarian interests. There was no shortage of Constantians, both their men and their women, he said, advancing their intentions. None she seemed to favor, though. Doubtless few were perceptive of that. Princess Posadas had always indulged in whatever coquetry was put before her. That was one trait Harshavadi had hoped she would have grown out of. Though Her Highness's mastery of her charm was no doubt an asset in diplomatic relations, it stirred all sorts of false impressions concerning the betting habits of their princess. "Damnation!" Tumani swore. "I wish she would court someone, if only to shut up the commoners. Feels like I have to discipline the DSF every week for the slander they whisper." Tumani's method of discipline for security force officers was transferring them to day shifts in the most remote desert villages she could find. Though Posadas had shown no interest in courting anyone at the gala, there was someone at the Lunar Festival that had captured Harshavadi's attentions. During the Massican auction on the festival's second night, Posadas had spent nearly the entire event with a tall, masked stranger. The mask itself was not unusual. The auction was, by tradition, a masquerade, but it was her balminess with someone he had, until then, thought to be an entire stranger that made Harshavadi question whether the man truly was unfamiliar to Her Highness. Though he only observed from a distance, the way she behaved in that man's company was not at all like how she was with the nobles at the gala. Her behavior had been looser, more casual. She had smiled and laughed in a different way in that man's company. The man never made any obvious gestures of affection towards her, but it was clear he had captured the full attention of Her Highness. Considering the prestige of the auction, the man had to be someone of note. Perhaps there was hope for their princess yet. Harshavadi smiled to himself, knowing this was just the sort of tale Tumani would relish in. An odd thumping sound interrupted that thought. "Did you hear that, Tumani?" he asked, trying to follow the sound. "Hear what?" she asked, and paused to listen. "That noise, like a drum." He pointed Tumani to the opposite end of the terrace, where a hall formed around the villa's inner wall. "It's coming from the patio." She nodded. "I can hear it now. Some guests took their drinks down there earlier, but last I checked, no one was there." "Let's investigate." Out of habit, Harshavadi poised his hand over his scimitar. Tumani shook her head, but followed after him. The only structure separating the hall from the elements was a banister that attached to the roof by the occasional pillar. The low thumping grew into a throbbing tone, growing further in intensity as they approached the patio. "To my side, Tumani," he whispered. Harshavadi pressed against the inner wall and sidled down its surface until they reached a corner. "I don't like this," she whispered back. Harshavadi hushed her. He glanced sideways and nudged that she was to follow. Steadying his breath, he turned the corner and drew his sword. Chairs were strewn about the patio haphazardly, and there was a small glass table covered with chalices. Some had spilled over it, but there was no one in the patio itself, and the beating had suddenly stopped. Harshavadi shivered. "How odd," he said. "It sounded like it was coming from here." He walked around, scouting the balcony. Tumani laughed nervously. "Maybe it was the masked devil playing a trick on us." It was an improper thing to say. Khonsu wouldn't dare be so bold as to show himself before the crown. However, Harshavadi considered how many of the tales surrounding Khonsu began with some sort of drawling noise before his appearance. The thought made him go stiff. "You know better than a joke like that around me," he snapped at Tumani. "Either call him by his name or call him a terrorist, but I won't hear any talk of devils." "Easy, Harshavadi." She lifted a hand on his shoulder, an attempt to massage him. "Those nobles have put you on edge. I only meant it as a jest." "Well, it was in poor taste. Let's check down below. Perhaps the noise came from there." The two guards walked away, leaving the patio empty. Khonsu breathed out in deep relief. The longer he could avoid a confrontation, the better. He waited until he was sure the two had left the hall, before he relaxed off of the nook in the patio's rafters that he had hidden himself in. He grabbed down its wood support beam and dropped to the floor. This would be the most dangerous crossing of the night yet, but he had already accepted the risk of what he was about to do. From the night's start, he knew he'd be walking over his own coffin. Khonsu glided through the hall and into the empty terrace. From there, he opened the villa's glass door into its second-floor living room. The noise inside was overpowering. Hundreds of guests were spread about the open chamber, some dining in the lower lounge, some sitting on couches, some sharing drinks over expensive glass sculptures. He managed to enter unnoticed, but when he moved down the hall of the gallery, it was as if he'd stepped on the toes of the entire room. A collective gasp echoed through the chamber, as people pointed and began shouting his name. He ignored them, and continued to the master suite, moving more briskly. He opened the door and stepped inside, quickly closing and bolting it behind him. 2 lamps cast a hazy tan light over the room. The bedchamber smelled strongly of a floral musk, leaking from a pot of smoking oil placed near the door. The ceilings of the room were high, but there was nothing for him to climb on. Much to his displeasure, there were also no windows. The walls were lined with immense tapestries, some historical, some ornamental. Equally large were the tasseled curtains lying bound up at each corner of the room. They concealed the gaps between the tapestries. That was something he could work with. Besatis' pillows had been carefully arranged around her bed mat. He found humor in that. Even in abduction, the princess planned to depart neatly. There was little else for her to organize, though. Besides a dark oaken dresser, Besatis' room was bare of extraneous furnishing. Khonsu approached the washroom, and a voice inside chastised him. "I requested not to be disturbed for the hour. Even still, you could have knocked." Her tone was light and peevish. This was hardly a time for her to feign ignorance. Yet, without hesitation, he played along with her game. "I beg your pardon, your highness," he replied with an exaggerated courtesy. "I did not think you would have let me in had I announced myself." "That all depends on who's at my door." Besatis cantered into the bedroom, making a show of brushing her full black hair off her shoulders. She wore a cashmere kaftan over a patterned blue dress. A thin layer of lace covered her neck and bosom where the kaftan hung loose. At her waist, a shimmering indigo sash caressed the kaftan tightly against the curves of her body. "Do you like it?" She lifted her arms and posed in front of him, letting the sleeves of the robe fall to her side. "It suits you," he said flatly. She had never been more cat-like, as the princess smiled and tilted her head in acceptance of his compliment. He looked back to the door and then to Besatis and asked, growing anxious, "Are you ready?" He had no idea where she found the confidence to laugh, but laugh she did, as she said, "As I'll ever be."